The morning I was assigned to Examiner Voss-Karath's Theory of Applied Systems seminar. The intake clerk at Admissions Bay 4 looked at my file, looked at me, looked at my file again, and said nothing. I was 12. The cadets filing in around me were 20, 25, one woman with gray threading her temples who moved like she'd already done this somewhere else and hadn't been impressed. The clerk stamped my intake sheet and handed it back without meeting my eyes. I figured that meant I was in the right room. I wasn't technically. A placement algorithm had cross-matched my aptitude scores against the wrong cohort index. Apparently a 12-year-old from the Kepler 452 colony stations posting identical marks to a senior intake cadet produced an edge case the system hadn't been asked to handle. The clerk knew it. Voss-Karath knew it when I walked in. I found out 3 hours later, which was fine because by then none of it mattered very much. Voss-Karath was tall in the way certain species are tall, not stretched but assembled from components that had simply decided to keep going. For limbs articulated at angles that made sense only in motion, a resonance organ low in the chest that gave his voice a quality like stone settling after a tremor. He wore his rank on a banded collar, 7 marks, and he did not look at me when I took my seat. I sat in the second row because the back was full and I didn't want to be in the front where he'd have to decide what to do about me too early. He introduced the diagnostic protocol, a live assessment his seminar had run unmodified for 91 years, scaled across 7 registered difficulty tiers, designed to give him a baseline reading on every cadet before the first formal lesson. He said it was not a test to be completed. He said it was a test to be endured, and that the point was not the score, but the shape of how each cadet's thinking degraded under progressive load. He handed out the interface tablets. He told us we had until he ended the session. The first tier was materials logic, how load-bearing structures failed across variable gravity coefficients. I'd grown up on a colony station where the engineers changed the gravity plating twice a year for maintenance reasons, and where any kid who didn't understand why the shells needed to be refastened each time learned the hard way. I worked through it in 11 minutes. Tier 2 was biological adaptation mapping, how organisms recalibrated metabolic processes in non-native atmospheric compositions. My mother was a xenobiologist. I had been hearing this over dinner since I was 5. I worked through it in 9 minutes. Around me, the adult cadets were quiet in the particular way that means concentration. The woman with the gray temples had her stylus moving in steady small arcs. The man to my left had filled an entire margin with handwritten notation, which meant he was the kind of thinker who needed to externalize before he could proceed. Not slow, just thorough. Nobody looked at me. I was apparently easy to forget when they had their heads down, which suited me. Tier 3 was applied orbital mechanics under non-standard mass distributions, the kind of problem that required holding 7 variables in your head simultaneously and adjusting each one as the others moved. I had to slow down. I have never minded thinking. It is waiting that I find difficult, the kind of waiting where you're expected to look uncertain so that other people feel comfortable. I worked through Tier 3 in 18 minutes and did not pretend it had cost me more than it did. Tier 4 was theoretical linguistics, how information degraded across translation matrices when the source language had no analogous concept in the target. I had grown up speaking 3 languages and spending holidays at my grandmother's station where a 4th was the only one that worked. The translation gaps she navigated every day of her professional life were the subject of more of her stories than anything else. I moved through Tier 4 in 14 minutes. At 52 minutes, I had completed 4 tiers. The room was still working on Tier 2. I looked at the tablet. It had loaded Tier 5 automatically, structural risk modeling under contested resource conditions, the kind of problem that shows up in genuine field decisions, not academic exercises. It was the first tier that felt like it had been written by someone who'd been in a room where the stakes were real. I appreciated that. I worked through it carefully, checking twice before committing answers, because careful is not the same as slow. Tiers 6 and 7 came in sequence. Tier 6 was inter-system treaty logic, conflict resolution frameworks across species whose foundational social assumptions shared no common axis. It was the hardest tier by a margin. I spent 21 minutes on it. When I finished, my thinking had the faint, raw quality that good problems leave when they've made genuine contact with the limits of what you know. Tier 7 was comparative historical analysis, pattern recognition across conflict cycles at civilizational scale. 9 minutes. Whether that said something about Tier 7 or something about me, I left as an open question. At 94 minutes, I completed Tier 7. The tablet sat blank. It did not load Tier 8. I waited because I thought perhaps there was a processing pause between tiers, some handshake the system needed to complete before it delivered the next section. I waited 3 minutes. The tablet remained blank. I turned it over to check if the display had frozen. It hadn't. The battery indicator was green. The session status field read, diagnostic complete. I raised my hand. Voss-Karath was at his station at the front of the room, monitoring the cohort's progress on a secondary display. He looked up when I raised my hand. The look he gave me was the same one the intake clerk had used, the one that meant the math wasn't resolving the way it was supposed to. I said, I think it finished. He crossed the room in 4 strides and looked at my tablet. He looked at it for a long time. His resonance organ produced a low sound that wasn't translated by my earpiece, which usually meant either a profanity or a prayer. He picked up the tablet and carried it back to his station. For 6 minutes, he worked at his station without speaking. I could see him pulling files on the secondary display, the archive, the postgraduate extension bank, something that required a 2-stage authentication I could see from the color of the interface panels. The room continued working around me. Nobody had noticed yet. Then he stopped. He stood with both hands flat on the station surface and looked at the display. He stood that way for almost a full minute. Then he reached for the room's address panel. He said, I've submitted a curriculum extension request to the Academy grid. The cadets around me looked up. This was not a normal thing for Voss-Karath to say in the middle of a diagnostic session. The woman with the gray temples had her stylus raised and still. The grid's response came back in 40 seconds. It appeared as a single line on his secondary display. I couldn't read it from the second row, but I didn't need to. He read it. He read it again. He set down the request terminal and turned to face the room. He said, the grid indicates there are no further questions available at this classification level. Silence. He turned to look at me. I said, is there a harder one? That was when I noticed that the room had changed. Not loudly. Nothing so obvious as a sound. The adult cadets had been facing their tablets, or the front wall, or the middle distance that people stare at when they're thinking hard. One by one, across the next few seconds, they turned to face me. Not all at once. Not as a gesture. 1, then 2, then 3 more. Until by the time the woman with the gray temples completed the turn, every person in the room was looking in my direction. Voss-Karath stood at the front for a moment longer. Then he crossed to his station, opened a new file, and began to write something I wasn't going to be able to read from the second row. I found out later it was a reclassification flag submitted directly to the intake registry. A formal notation that the placement algorithm had not made an error so much as failed to anticipate a result it had never been asked to process. He taught the lesson after that. He taught it to all of us, the adult cadets, and me, and he taught it the same way he would have taught any other cohort on any other morning, which was a right thing to do. But when he moved to the secondary display to run the day's first worked example and asked the room for an initial variable estimate, he did not look at the senior cadets first. He looked at the second row. I gave him the estimate. It was correct. He recorded it without comment and moved on. That was 23 years ago. I still have the intake chit. The clerk stamp is slightly off-center, the ink a little thin at the upper right corner, the way hand stamps go when the pad is running low and nobody's replaced it yet. I keep it because it is the only official record that places me in that room on that morning, and because the Academy's intake registry, for reasons that were never formally explained to me, still carries my original cohort assignment under a classification code that wasn't created until 6 weeks after I arrived. I don't know what the code means. I've never looked it up. I have a reasonable suspicion it means something like result not anticipated. Filed pending further instruction. That seems accurate enough.